So these are just examples of how abuse and violation of human rights in Libya is actually stated in law. It's embedded in law, and that is very, very serious. You have a framework of laws and rules and regulations that actually strip a vast range of basic rights for the ordinary citizens, and people who violate them will be severely punished. Now, I very quickly move to something which I believe has not at all received any coverage or wide coverage that it deserves in the international arena, and that is the mass murder or massacre of Abu Salim prison. Although in the last 2 years it has received quite a good coverage in the independent reports of people like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and some media outlets have covered, but it's still not really received the attention it deserves. We are talking about here an act of mass murder, of a genocide, which is within the continent of Africa, is only second in magnitude to the massacre of Rwanda. We are talking about the deliberate, cold-blooded murder of 1,200 political prisoners in one morning, within the space of about 4 or 5 hours, on the 29th of June, 1996. Purely because these political prisoners, the day before, they have complained about their ill treatment and the lack of medical care and the lack of food, and they have taken one prisoner guard as captive, and they wanted to negotiate. So the response from the Libyan regime is next morning to gather all of them outside in the main prison courtyard and to start shooting at them, and then going inside the jails and killing the rest and finishing the rest, ending up with 1,200 political prisoners who are there purely for their political ideas and political views, killed and murdered like that. I say this has not been received because if this happened anywhere else, in any other country, I think you would have received a wide coverage and a wide condemnation internationally. Unfortunately, for whatever it is reason, because it's Libya, it hasn't really received that coverage. And I'm here just to remind you, and please don't take my word for it, go to Amnesty International, go to Human Rights Watch and other independent, reputable international organizations, and they will give you chapter and verse about this massacre, because we have survivors who are eyewitnesses who gave very detailed accounts, and some of them now live outside. Another development, which was a positive development, unfortunately then it relapsed, and that is the abolishment of the People's Court. A People's Court was set up purely to try those for political crimes. In other words, those who are critical of the regime. The political court did not meet any international standards of judicial courts whatsoever. There was a lot of criticism internally and internationally about it. The Libyan regime did abolish it a few years ago. Unfortunately, immediately after that, they set up another court called the State Security Court. So today, we have the State Security Court in Libya, which has exactly the same jurisdiction and role of the People's Court. It will still try anybody who's critical of the regime with no guarantees, no defense, no lawyers, no open hearing, nothing. And then the court can sentence them to any sentence, and people cannot appeal. Obviously, this is a total violation and also completely contrary to the most basic standards of courts and judicial systems around the world. Finally, I'll just come around to some recent developments. On December the 12th, Human Rights Watch bravely and publicly went to announce its comprehensive report on Libya, human rights in Libya from Tripoli. I think that was a great move, it was a courageous move, and also, let's be honest here, it was a positive step for the Libyan regime and the Libyan authorities to allow an international organization who is obviously bound to be critical of what's going on in Libya to come to Tripoli and publicly produce this report and announce it and talk about it. Unfortunately, within the Corinthia hotel where they conducted the press conference, there were elements of the Libyan security agents who were deliberately there to actually, if you like, spoil the occasion. And I think the conference, although the gentleman from Human Rights Watch is here and perhaps can give us more details, the conference was abruptly adjourned just after about 40 minutes or so. But still, it was a positive move. Yet, even during those recent weeks and days, we still have political activists and critics who are rounded and arrested for no reason just because they are critics. A very good example of this is a political activist called Jamal al-Hajji. Now, he openly criticized the regime for lack of freedom, for violations of human rights. He spoke to BBC World and other media organizations. He spoke to Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, and yet he was arrested a few weeks ago and still no word from him whatsoever. Other activists are also being arrested. And finally, just 2 days ago, we had the Libyan authorities stopping and blocking YouTube and also blocking all Libyan internet websites who are broadcasting or posting from outside Libya, which is a total violation of basic human right of having access to the World Wide Web and to information which is independent from the Libyan regime and is not controlled by the Libyan regime.
Gohan, thank you very much for and a very brief and precise description of what's going on. And there is someone else who's an expert on this issue, and that's His Excellency Oliver Miles, the former ambassador, British ambassador in Libya, and he was the last British ambassador in 1984 when the relations broke, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Looking at the list of speakers on this subject, I've got an uncomfortable feeling that unless I'm careful, I shall be cast as the advocate for Gaddafi and the Libyan regime. Well, I don't mind how I'm cast. There are two sides to every story, and I shall try to give both sides a fair account. The subject tonight, the title of our meeting is in two parts. It refers to state terrorism and then it refers to human rights. And I want to say a word about state terrorism first. It's not a term that I am at all comfortable with personally. I don't think it's a very useful category. Of course, it's perfectly true that Libya did sponsor or protect the IRA, Abu Nidal, and other extremist, other terrorist groups, no question. The shooting of WPC Yvonne Fletcher from the Libyan People's Bureau in London was an outrage by any standards. I myself was, while in my brief time as ambassador, was involved in obtaining the release from prison of a British subject called Philip Charles, who had been held without charge by the revolutionary committees and had been tortured and was in very poor shape when he was handed over to me, and I managed to get him back to Britain. But state terrorism, well, terrorism itself is a slippery word, as we all know. It's a very difficult word to define. I have often challenged audiences to produce a definition of state terrorism which would include, for example, the murder of WPC Fletcher, but exclude the American bombing raids from British bases on Tripoli and Benghazi in 1986. I've not yet found such a definition. I devised a definition of my own, which related to the idea that terrorism is not just killing people or other atrocities, but it's actually using terror for political purposes. But then, at the beginning of the Iraq War, we were told that the Americans had named their bombing campaign in Iraq shock and awe. So was that state terrorism? And if not, how are we going to define state terrorism to exclude it? I prefer to talk about crime. So much for state terrorism. Let me come on now to I think what is the real subject of our discussion this evening, human rights in Libya. And I am not going to try to summarize even the abuses or the improvements which may or may not have taken place in Libya, because we've got two expert speakers who I'm sure will want to do that from Amnesty and from Human Rights Watch. So I don't want to duplicate what they will be saying. I want to put it into context. One thing that people forget when they're thinking about Libya is what an extremely poor country Libya was. It comes out of a dirt poor background. It was one of the poorest countries in the world until oil arrived shortly before the revolution, but only shortly before. I've seen a figure a United Nations figure of $30 per head annual income per capita before the revolution in Libya. So you need to take this into account in considering the Libyan story. Another thing, of course, you have to take into account is that since 1969, Libya has been dominated by a single personality, a very remarkable personality, which my speaker on my right, I'm sure, is going to refer to, because I see his new book on the subject of Gaddafi has just come into his hands.